Sheriff Lucas Carter was enjoying a peaceful morning at home when an unexpected knock at the door shattered the tranquility. What he didn't expect was to find a group of so-called HOA officers attempting to enforce bogus fines and even trying to arrest him. What followed was a lesson in real justice. It was a crisp, quiet morning in the suburbs, the kind where the biggest concern should have been whether the coffee was hot enough or if the morning newspaper had arrived on time. Sheriff Lucas Carter had just settled into his recliner, the warm ceramic of his coffee mug resting comfortably in his palm. He exhaled, letting the weight of the morning ease into his muscles, the television murmuring softly in the background. It was supposed to be a peaceful start to his day, until the knocking came. At first, it was just a few loud raps. Firm, deliberate, but not yet aggressive. Lucas ignored it, assuming it was a delivery or a neighbor stopping by. But then the pounding started again, louder this time, more insistent, like someone meant business. Frowning, Lucas set his coffee down and stood up, his lawman's instincts kicking in. He had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when someone was making a power play at his front door. This wasn't a friendly visit. As he approached the door, he peered through the peephole and was met with an odd sight. 3 men standing stiffly on his porch, dressed in what appeared to be law enforcement uniforms. But something was off. The fabric was too cheap, the fit too loose, and the badges pinned to their shirts gleamed too much in the morning sun, like plastic toys fresh out of a bargain bin. Curiosity and amusement flickered through Lucas as he pulled open the door. The tallest of the 3, a middle-aged man with a thick mustache and mirrored sunglasses, stepped forward, his chest puffed out like a rooster in a henhouse. His 2 lackeys stood behind him, arms crossed, faces set in poorly imitated authority. "Sir," the mustached man said in a deep, overly rehearsed voice, "we need you to step outside immediately." Lucas raised an eyebrow, taking in the man's stance, his badge, the stiffness of his shoulders. "And you are?" "We're with the Neighborhood Compliance Task Force," the man declared, flashing his badge. "You've violated multiple community ordinances, and we are here to bring you in." Lucas barely managed to keep a straight face. He crossed his arms. "The HOA has a compliance task force now." The mustached man lifted his chin, clearly expecting immediate obedience. "We do. And we don't tolerate noncompliance." Lucas fought back a smirk. "Noncompliance, huh? And what exactly am I in violation of?" One of the lackeys pulled out a clipboard and cleared his throat, reading from what appeared to be a pre-written script. "Sir, you have been cited for an unapproved mailbox design and unauthorized lawn furniture." Lucas blinked. "My mailbox?" The mustached man nodded solemnly. "Your mailbox?" Lucas turned his head, glancing over at the perfectly ordinary black mailbox standing at the edge of his driveway. "What's wrong with it?" "It does not conform to the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines," the lackey read, pushing his glasses up his nose. Lucas let out a small chuckle and turned back to the men. "And my lawn furniture?" The mustached man hesitated. He glanced at his clipboard, then back at Lucas. "It's unapproved." Lucas motioned to the 2 Adirondack chairs sitting on his porch, completely unassuming. "You mean those?" "Yes," the man said stiffly. "They do not meet the HOA's designated color and material standards." Lucas exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head in disbelief. "Let me get this straight. You're here to arrest me over a mailbox and some patio chairs." "This isn't a joke," the mustached man snapped, taking a step closer. "Noncompliance with HOA ordinances is a serious matter. You're coming with us." Lucas's amusement quickly faded. He straightened his shoulders, his posture shifting from relaxed to authoritative. "And where exactly are you planning to take me?" The man squared his shoulders. "To our holding facility." Lucas tilted his head. "Holding facility?" The mustached man's face reddened slightly. "It's not a jail. It's a compliance center." Lucas let out a slow breath, rubbing his jaw. He could feel his patience wearing thin. "Well, gentlemen, I hate to break it to you, but I'm a little busy today, so I'll have to decline your invitation." The mustached man's patience snapped. "That's it," he barked, stepping forward aggressively. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Lucas didn't move. He held the man's gaze, unblinking. "Or what?" One of the lackeys, emboldened by his boss's anger, stepped up and pulled out a cheap pair of handcuffs that looked like they would snap in half with a firm tug. "Do it now, sir, or we'll be forced to take action." Lucas sighed and shook his head. "All right." He reached down to his hip, not for a weapon, but for the small radio clipped to his belt. With a quick press of the button, he sent out a silent distress signal to his deputies, all without breaking eye contact with the so-called officers. The mustached man grinned, clearly thinking he had won. "That's right," he said smugly. "You're learning your place." Lucas held back another chuckle. "Oh, I know my place." As soon as the lackey stepped forward to slap the flimsy cuffs on him, Lucas moved. In a single swift motion, he grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it behind his back, and spun him toward the nearest car. The man yelped as his face smacked against the hood. The mustached man staggered back. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Lucas glanced at him, still holding the struggling man in place. "Performing a citizen's arrest." Before the other two could react, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Within seconds, real police vehicles skidded to a stop, red and blue lights bouncing off the nearby houses. The so-called HOA officers froze, their self-assured posturing vanishing in an instant. Lucas leaned in close to the man he had pinned. "Now let's talk about who's really under arrest." The air was thick with tension. Sheriff Lucas Carter stood his ground, one of the fake officers still pinned against the hood of his car, while the mustached man and the second lackey stood frozen in place. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the nearby houses. The so-called enforcers had been so sure of their authority just moments ago, but now, reality was beginning to set in. The mustached man took a step back, his confidence flickering like a candle in the wind. "Listen, there's no need for all this. We were just doing our job," he started, but Lucas cut him off with a sharp glare. "Your job?" Lucas scoffed. "Last I checked, impersonating law enforcement isn't part of any HOA job description." Deputy Reynolds was the first to step out of his patrol car, followed by two other uniformed officers. He surveyed the scene with a smirk, taking in the man Lucas had restrained. "Boss, you mind telling me why you're wrestling with a guy in a cheap security outfit?" Lucas finally let go of the struggling lackey, who stumbled backward, rubbing his wrist. These three were in the middle of conducting an unlawful arrest. Figured I'd save them the trouble of doing it the hard way. Reynolds let out a low whistle and turned toward the mustached man. "All right, let's see some IDs." The mustached man hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right excuse. "Look, there's been a misunderstanding. We're authorized HOA enforcement officers." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Authorized by who?" The mustached man straightened, puffing out his chest again, though there was a noticeable tremor in his voice. "The Homeowners Association Security Division." Reynolds let out a chuckle and turned to Lucas. "That's not a thing, right?" Lucas smirked. "Nope." The second lackey, still rubbing his wrist, quickly jumped in. "It is. We were given jurisdiction over all properties in this neighborhood." Lucas tilted his head. "Jurisdiction?" He turned to Reynolds. "Deputy, did we approve any kind of HOA police force?" Reynolds shook his head. "Nope." Lucas turned back to the mustached man. "Well, there you have it. You're just some guys running around playing dress-up." The mustached man's face darkened. "You don't understand. We were only enforcing compliance. We have every right to detain rule breakers." Lucas stepped closer, his voice steel-cold. "Detain? You tried to arrest me over a mailbox." The man hesitated, clearly realizing how ridiculous it sounded. "Well, technically." "There's no technically about it," Lucas snapped. "You tried to put cuffs on me. That's impersonating law enforcement, and depending on how you plan to detain me, we could be talking about unlawful restraint or worse." Reynolds folded his arms. "So let's start with some real names and real IDs." The three men hesitated, exchanging nervous glances before reluctantly pulling out their wallets. Reynolds flipped through them and let out a laugh. "Boss, you're gonna love this. Not a single one of them is a registered security guard. They don't even have basic certifications." Lucas sighed. "So, you're telling me they're not even rent-a-cops?" Reynolds shook his head. "Nope. Just some guys in cheap uniforms pretending to be cops." The mustached man shifted uncomfortably. "Look, we were just following orders." Lucas narrowed his eyes. "Whose orders?" The man hesitated. "The HOA board." Lucas crossed his arms. "Got any paperwork to prove that?" The second lackey quickly reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled document, handing it over. Reynolds took one look at it and scoffed. "This isn't a contract. It's a volunteer neighborhood watch form." Lucas shook his head. So let me get this straight. You three decided that meant you could run around pretending to be cops and extorting homeowners. The mustached man pressed his lips into a thin line. It wasn't extortion. It was community enforcement. Lucas gave him a hard stare. How much were you charging people for these so-called violations? The lackeys exchanged nervous glances, but said nothing. Lucas exhaled through his nose. Deputy, check their vehicle. Reynolds nodded and walked over to the HOA-branded SUV parked by the curb. He pulled open the door and started rifling through the contents. A moment later, he let out a low whistle. Well. We've got ticket books, fine notices, and, would you look at that, a cash box. Lucas turned back to the mustached man. You running an HOA or a roadside scam? The man swallowed hard. We were just collecting fees. No, Lucas corrected. What you were doing was fraud. The second lackey blurted out. We were told to do it. The board promised us a cut. Lucas exchanged a glance with Reynolds. Now we're getting somewhere. Reynolds flipped through a ledger he had pulled from the SUV. Boss, they've been hitting the whole neighborhood. Fake fines, intimidation tactics, even threats of foreclosure. Lucas let out a slow sigh. And people actually paid them? Reynolds nodded. Looks like it. Lucas turned back to the three men. So here's what's going to happen. You're all being detained while we investigate. If you're lucky, you'll just be looking at fraud charges. If we find out you threatened or coerced anyone into paying, it's going to get a whole lot worse. The mustached man tried to protest. You can't arrest us for enforcing community rules. Lucas gave him a dry look. Watch me. Reynolds stepped forward, pulling out a set of real handcuffs. All right, boys. Turn around. The mustached man opened his mouth to argue, but when Reynolds raised an eyebrow, he slowly complied. The two lackeys followed, both looking thoroughly defeated as Reynolds cuffed them and started reading them their rights. As the three fake officers stood handcuffed, their faces pale with realization, Sheriff Lucas Carter knew this was just the beginning. He turned to Deputy Reynolds, who was still combing through the contents of the HOA-branded SUV. With a small smirk, Reynolds held up a thick binder filled with handwritten notes and fine slips. Boss, you might want to take a look at this, Reynolds called out. Lucas walked over and took the binder from Reynolds, flipping through its pages. Inside were hundreds of recorded violations, bogus fines slapped on unsuspecting homeowners. Some were for trivial infractions like incorrectly positioned flower pots, while others were outright absurd, such as grass length exceeding regulation by half an inch. Even more disturbing, some of the records contained payment details. The fake officers had been collecting cash from residents, and none of it was being funneled back into the community. Instead, it was being pocketed. Lucas let out a low whistle. Well. We've got ourselves a real money-making operation here. Reynolds shook his head. Looks like they've been running this racket for a while. You see these dates? Some of these go back almost a year. Lucas turned to the three cuffed men. Care to explain where all this money has been going? The mustached man shifted uncomfortably. We were just following orders, he muttered, his bravado completely gone. Lucas narrowed his eyes. Yeah? And whose orders? The second lackey hesitated before blurting out. The HOA board. They told us to enforce the rules and collect the fines. They said we'd get a cut for our work. Lucas and Reynolds exchanged a knowing glance. This was bigger than just a few guys pretending to be cops. This was a full-scale corruption scheme orchestrated by the HOA board. One of the other deputies approached with another discovery from the SUV. Sheriff, you're going to want to see this. Lucas took the file handed to him. Inside were formal-looking letters. Letters that threatened homeowners with foreclosure if they didn't comply with the fake citations. Some of the letters even had official HOA letterheads, giving them a terrifying sense of legitimacy. This isn't just fraud, Lucas said, his voice laced with anger. This is extortion. Reynolds whistled. They weren't just fining people. They were scaring them into submission. And judging by these numbers, they made thousands off of it. A small group of neighbors had gathered nearby, murmuring among themselves. One elderly man stepped forward, adjusting his glasses nervously. Sheriff, he said, his voice wavering. Does this mean we'll get our money back? Lucas gave him a reassuring nod. Keep any receipts or records of payments you made. This evidence will go straight to the county prosecutor, and I promise you, we'll make sure justice is served. Another woman, middle-aged with a determined glint in her eyes, spoke up. I paid over $500 last month for a supposed non-compliant driveway color. My driveway is the same shade of concrete it's been for years. A murmur of agreement spread through the growing crowd. More and more residents began stepping forward, each with their own horror story of intimidation, unjust fines, and the fear they'd lived under for months, even years. Lucas turned back to Reynolds. "We're not done yet. It's time to pay the HOA board a visit." Reynolds grinned, snapping his notebook shut. "Oh, I've been looking forward to this." With the evidence secured and the fake enforcers properly detained, Lucas and his team headed to the HOA office. The board members had no idea what was coming. Sheriff Lucas Carter and his deputies wasted no time. With solid evidence in hand, they drove straight to the HOA office, ready to confront the people behind the scam. The office was a small, overly polished building that sat near the entrance of the neighborhood, meant to project authority. But today, its walls would echo with accountability. As they walked in, they found the HOA board members already gathered, their faces a mix of feigned innocence and thinly veiled nervousness. It was clear that word had spread fast about the arrests of their so-called enforcement officers. The board president, a wiry man in a suit that seemed one size too big, attempted to put on a diplomatic front. "Sheriff Carter," he said, forcing a smile. "I assume there's been some sort of misunderstanding." Lucas didn't buy the act. He dropped the thick binder of fraudulent fines and payment records onto the conference table with a loud thud. "You want to talk about misunderstandings? How about explaining why your board has been running an extortion racket under the guise of community enforcement?" The president's smile twitched, but he quickly regained composure. "We were simply enforcing neighborhood standards, Sheriff. Our residents agree to certain rules when they move in. Surely you understand that maintaining property values requires order." Lucas nodded, leaning forward slightly. "Order, huh? Is that what you call threatening elderly residents with foreclosure over fake violations? Charging homeowners hundreds of dollars for mailbox designs and lawn furniture you don't approve of?" One of the other board members, a woman with sharp silver hair and an expression that seemed permanently disapproving, scoffed. "This is absurd. The HOA has every right to enforce its guidelines. If people don't like it, they shouldn't live here." Deputy Reynolds let out a low whistle. "That's some fine customer service." The board president cleared his throat. "Sheriff, let's not get dramatic. Perhaps a few of our volunteers were overzealous. But surely this can be handled internally. There's no need for law enforcement involvement." Lucas chuckled, shaking his head. "That's where you're wrong. See, your volunteers already spilled the truth. They were promised a cut of the fines they collected. And based on these financial records, he flipped through the ledger they had taken from the fake enforcer's SUV. It looks like a whole lot of money was being funneled into personal accounts. Care to explain that?" The board members shifted uncomfortably. The silver-haired woman spoke up again. "Any funds collected were used for neighborhood improvements." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "Because from what I see here, a large chunk of that money went straight into the HOA president's personal bank account, along with a few unexplained expenses for luxury dining, private golf club memberships, and," he paused, flipping a page, "a trip to the Bahamas." The room fell silent. The board president's face turned a shade paler. "This is ridiculous," he stammered. "You have no proof that money wasn't for legitimate association expenses." Lucas tapped the ledger. "Oh, we've got all the proof we need. And once we get forensic accountants to go through these records, I'm willing to bet we'll find even more." Reynolds folded his arms. "Here's the deal. Right now, we've got enough to charge you with fraud and conspiracy. If you cooperate and start refunding the homeowners you scammed, things might go a little easier for you." The silver-haired woman scoffed. "This is outrageous. The HOA has operated this way for years." Lucas gave her a hard look. "Yeah? Well, that ends today." Another board member, a younger man who had remained silent, suddenly spoke up. Wait," he said, raising his hands. "If I cooperate and give you access to all the financial records, do I still get arrested?" The board president shot him a glare, but Lucas smirked. "You help us bring down the operation, and the prosecutor might be willing to cut you a deal." The man nodded quickly. "Then I'm in." The president slammed a hand on the table. "You traitor." Lucas straightened. "Well, gentlemen, I think it's about time we took this to the station." Deputy Reynolds and the other officers moved in, pulling out their handcuffs. One by one, the board members were restrained and read their rights. As the president was let out, he shouted, "You can't do this. We were just enforcing rules. You'll regret this." Lucas sighed. The only ones regretting anything are the people who thought they could get away with stealing from their own community. With the corrupt HOA board members securely in custody, Sheriff Lucas Carter and his deputies turned their focus to making things right for the residents. The aftermath of the arrests had sent shockwaves through the community. News of the scandal spread fast, and by the next morning, homeowners gathered outside the HOA office, eager to know what would happen next. Many of them had suffered under the fraudulent rule of the board, paying hefty fines for fabricated violations, facing threats of foreclosure, and living in fear of petty HOA enforcers knocking on their doors. Now, they wanted justice. Lucas stood before the crowd, addressing their concerns. "I know many of you have been affected by the HOA's illegal activities. We are working with the county prosecutor to ensure that every stolen dollar is accounted for and returned to its rightful owner." A murmur of relief swept through the crowd, followed by applause. An elderly woman stepped forward, holding a folder full of receipts. "Sheriff, I kept records of every fine they made me pay. Will I get my money back?" Lucas nodded. "Absolutely. We're collecting documentation from all residents, so keep those receipts safe. Once the prosecutor finalizes the charges, restitution will be part of the case." Deputy Reynolds, standing beside Lucas, added, "If you've been threatened, coerced, or forced to pay fines unfairly, now's the time to come forward. Your statements will help strengthen the case." Several people stepped forward eagerly, sharing their stories of harassment and intimidation by the so-called HOA officers. Some even admitted they had been too afraid to speak up before, fearing retaliation. Now they felt safe. Following the arrests, county officials suspended all HOA operations in the neighborhood. A temporary oversight committee was appointed, composed of honest homeowners who wanted to rebuild trust and transparency. One of the newly appointed members, a no-nonsense woman named Karen Brooks, addressed the crowd later that week. "We're going to fix this mess," she declared. "No more shady fees, no more bogus citations. This HOA is going back to what it was meant to be, a community, not a dictatorship." Her words were met with cheers. Lucas and his team had been invited to the first meeting of the new HOA Oversight Board, where they provided insights on how the corrupt practices had taken root and what safeguards could be put in place to prevent similar schemes in the future. Residents felt empowered, many speaking up for the first time in years about the oppressive and unfair rules they had endured. It was the beginning of real change. With the corrupt board gone, the entire neighborhood felt a weight lift. People no longer hesitated to chat with their neighbors, plant flowers in their yards, or park their cars in their own driveways without fear of a fine appearing in their mailbox the next day. A group of residents decided to organize a block party to celebrate. As the sun set on a warm Saturday evening, families gathered on their front lawns. Tables were set up with homemade dishes, kids played in the street, and music filled the air. It was a celebration of freedom, freedom from the fear and manipulation that had ruled over them for so long. Lucas and his deputies were the guests of honor. As he walked through the crowd, people patted him on the back, thanked him, and offered him plates of barbecue and pie. An older man in a golf cap approached Lucas with a smirk. "Sheriff, you ever thought about running for office?" Lucas laughed, shaking his head. "I think I'll stick to putting bad guys behind bars." The man chuckled. "Well, if you ever change your mind, you've got my vote." Across the street, Reynolds leaned against a patrol car, watching the festivities with a grin. "You know, Sheriff, this might be the first time I've seen an investigation end with a community cookout." Lucas took a sip of the cold beer someone had handed him and smirked. People love seeing justice served. The party continued late into the night, with the community coming together in a way it hadn't in years. The neighborhood had been through a storm, but now, under the glow of porch lights and laughter, it felt like home again. For Lucas Carter, it was just another day of doing what was right, but for the residents, it was the day they got their neighborhood back. Lessons from this story. This story serves as a powerful reminder that power should never be abused. The fake HOA enforcers manipulated authority to exploit innocent homeowners, but justice prevailed. It highlights the importance of knowing your rights, standing up against fraud, and ensuring that those in positions of power are held accountable. Furthermore, It teaches us that courage in the face of intimidation can create lasting change. Fear often prevents people from speaking out against wrongdoing. But as seen in this story, a single act of defiance can inspire an entire community to take action. Strength lies in unity, and when people stand together, they can dismantle even the most deeply ingrained corruption. Another key takeaway is the significance of ethical leadership. Those entrusted with power should act with integrity and fairness, not use their positions for personal gain. When leaders abuse their authority, it is the duty of the people to challenge them, seek justice, and ensure they are held accountable. Additionally, this story is a stark reminder of the importance of staying informed about local governance and legal rights. Many homeowners complied with unjust fines simply because they didn't know they had the power to resist. Education and awareness play a crucial role in preventing scams and safeguarding communities from similar exploitation in the future. Meaningful message. Corruption and greed may flourish for a while, but eventually, justice catches up. This story is a testament to the strength of communities when they unite against wrongdoing. It's a reminder that silence enables oppression, but courage and determination can bring about real change. Personal perspective. From a personal standpoint, this story reinforces my belief in the importance of ethical leadership and vigilance. No one should be above the law, and those who misuse their power should be exposed. This tale is proof that when people stand together and fight back, they can reclaim their rights and dignity. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more incredible tales of justice, truth, and resilience, make sure to subscribe to our channel, Story Precious. We bring you the most compelling stories that not only entertain, but also inspire and educate. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Like, comment, and share this video to spread awareness. Thank you for being part of our growing community.